All right, let's get the very latest now on the story. Joining us via our Skype line is senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, Ottilia Maunganidze. Ottilia, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Given your experiences of pressure and severe criticism of the judiciary here at home over the past few years, should South Africans be worried by what happened over the weekend?
People should be concerned that the offices of the Chief Justice were raided, essentially. The main concern, obviously, being that these are computers that have information of a number of judges in South Africa, and that is something that any law-abiding citizen would be concerned about, especially because there are concerns around intimidation of the judiciary, but also there are concerns around whether or not the judiciary can continue to remain independent at a time where there's so much political pressure.
Ottilia, the cynics among us may look at this incident over the weekend and see a pattern where things seem to be escalating from criticism of the judiciary to outright hostility and then a full-on assault.
Well, it's quite difficult to tell at the moment because the offices that were burgled are the offices in Midrand and primarily the Human Resources Department. So it's quite difficult to tell whether or not this robbery was politically motivated. But of course, as you rightly pointed out, with the concerns that have been there around intimidation of the judiciary and calls for the judiciary to perform in a certain way, it shouldn't be taken lightly that their offices were burgled, and in fact that the Justice Ministry is looking into not only investigating this, but also ensuring that the judges themselves, as well as their officers, are fully protected is something that should be welcomed.
Ottilia, are there lessons for South Africa in how the judiciary has come under pressure in countries like Zimbabwe, for example, in Nigeria? In Zimbabwe, we saw in the early 2000s the pressure saw mass resignation of judges there. In Nigeria, we saw 7 judges raided and arrested just last year. The government then said it was anti-corruption operations. What can South Africa learn from all of this?
Protecting separation of powers, ensuring that the judiciary is independent, but also that the judiciary is able to carry out its work is something that democratic countries should be working towards. Where we see, as the incidents you've cited, where we see instances where the judiciary are intimidated, it does in many ways undermine the strength of that institution. And ultimately, it puts to question, constitutionalism in the country. So South Africa ought to be drawing these negative lessons from other countries and essentially ensuring that as best as we possibly can, not only through government, but also through civil society, protect fearlessly separation of powers. And that really means not just the judiciary, but it also means ensuring that Parliament as well as the executive are working to serve the interests of the citizens, not necessarily just themselves.
Ottilia, talk to us about the powers given to presidents in constitutional democracies such as ours. Do they pose a threat in a way to the independence of the judiciary?
Well, not always. So where presidents, for example, do have the powers related to appointment of judges, but if that power is tempered down, as in the case in South Africa, where you have a Judicial Services Commission and where you have essentially recommendations on appointment so the executive doesn't act unilaterally, that allows for essentially checks and balances within the system. What ought to be warned against is the excesses in the exercise of executive powers. So where, for example, judges are dismissed in a way that is not too clear, or in a way that suggests that there is bias against particular judges, that is something that needs to be guarded against. I suppose in a country where the executive, parliament, and the judiciary are still relatively working properly and are functional, it helps to be able then to approach the various institutions to ensure that the executive does not have excessive powers. But, and this is something worth warning against, sometimes even operating within the framework of the Constitution, there can be abuse of power.
Right. Ottilia Maunganidze is Senior Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies. Thanks so much for your time this afternoon.